The wind howled low across the Dakota plains as Samuel Cross sat alone in his cabin, a single lantern flickering against the rough-hewn walls, his rifle resting within easy reach beside the worn rocker. For 7 years, he had lived without company, his words spent mostly on cattle, and the occasional prayer spoken more out of habit than hope. But on that cold midnight, as the clock ticked slow against the darkness, a sound shattered his solitude, the unmistakable knock of 10 fists against his wooden door. He froze, heart hammering harder than the storms that swept across his land, for no man traveled these hills at midnight unless chased by ghosts or worse. Rising slow, he grasped the rifle and approached the door, each step echoing against the hollow quiet. He paused, listening, and in that silence came voices, low, steady, speaking Apache words he only half remembered from his father's war stories. 10 of them, maybe more, standing just beyond the thin barrier of pine planks, waiting. He could fire first, as instinct screamed, end this night before it began, but something in their voices stopped him. There was no war cry, no demand, only steady words wrapped in the cold air. Against every survival lesson he knew, Samuel unlatched the door and opened it a crack. Moonlight spilled across faces sharp with weariness, not anger. Their leader, tall and worn by years of dust and battle, stepped forward and met Samuel's wary gaze. In his broken English, he spoke the truth that cut sharper than fear. "Our children are freezing. We need fire, or they will die before morning." Samuel's grip tightened on the rifle, torn between the stories that said these men had burned settlements and the simple, undeniable truth standing in front of him. A truth written in tired eyes and shaking shoulders. He scanned the figures behind the leader and saw, to his surprise, not warriors armed for blood, but families wrapped in thin blankets, children too small to carry their own weight, women whose faces bore the same desperation as any settler's wife caught in a winter storm. Silence stretched between them, wide and dangerous, until Samuel stepped aside and opened the door wider. He said nothing, for words had failed him too many times before. Instead, he stoked the fire higher, setting out what little food remained in his cupboard, and waited to see if mercy could hold longer than fear. That night, the wind outside screamed like 1,000 ghosts, but within those cabin walls, a fragile peace took its first trembling breath. The fire crackled low in the hearth, casting long shadows across the worn floor as 10 Apaches stepped cautiously into Samuel Cross's cabin, their movements slow but certain, as if they expected the warmth to vanish the moment they trusted it. Samuel sat by the fire, rifle resting across his lap, his eyes watchful but steady, studying the strangers who now shared his walls. They spoke in quiet murmurs, words slipping between Apache and broken English, tending first to the children whose shivering limbs betrayed just how close death had been before they knocked on his door. The eldest woman unwrapped her youngest child, laying the boy beside the fire, his breath shallow but present, while the leader, whose name Samuel had not yet asked, placed a small pouch of dried roots on the table in silent offering. Samuel, unsure whether it was payment or gratitude, accepted it with a nod, choosing to believe it was both. Hours passed as the storm clawed at the cabin walls, wind and snow howling like wolves denied their prey. Samuel handed out blankets and biscuits, his stores dwindling but his conscience unwilling to watch a child starve. He found himself listening to their quiet conversations, catching names and stories layered with hardship and exile, not unlike his own silent struggles since the war took everything he once loved. When the youngest girl woke screaming from a fever dream, Samuel stirred a pot of willow bark tea, pressing the cup gently into her mother's hands, their fingers brushing not with fear, but with something closer to understanding. No smiles crossed their faces that night, only cautious glances and small nods of respect. But in that fragile exchange, Samuel realized that enemies rarely looked so human up close. The leader finally spoke his name. Taklisha. His voice rough but clear. He told Samuel they had fled soldiers who burned their winter camp and scattered their families into the frozen hills. They had walked for days without food, without shelter, their numbers thinning with each mile. Samuel listened, the weight of their suffering settling beside his own loneliness like a familiar companion. He spoke little of his own past, only admitting that he too had lost his family to a war where both sides claimed righteousness and left widows in their wake. As dawn crept over the horizon, casting pale light through frost-crusted windows, Samuel stoked the fire once more, knowing that when the storm broke, choices would come like hard riders, choices of trust, of survival, and of whether this fragile peace could last beyond the warmth of a single night. When the storm finally broke, the prairie stretched wide and silent beneath a sky scrubbed clean of clouds. But inside Samuel Cross's cabin, the tension still clung to the air like smoke that refused to lift. He rose early, boots creaking against the cold floor, and stepped outside to assess the land, his breath curling in the sharp dawn as he scanned for signs of soldiers or worse. The Apaches remained inside, tending to the weakest among them, their movements slow and guarded, uncertain if Samuel's mercy would last beyond the night. He returned with a fresh bucket of well water and a sack of cornmeal, setting them beside the fire without a word, and for the first time since they arrived, Taklisha met his eyes with something beyond caution, something close to respect. The children ate slowly, their thin fingers crumbling the cornbread as if it might vanish before their hunger could finish it, while the women repaired torn moccasins beside the hearth. Samuel watched them, seeing not the wild raiders the town had warned him about, but a battered people doing what they must to survive a world that gave them no kindness. As the sun climbed higher, Taklisha approached Samuel with a simple question carried on quiet breath. Where would they go now? The army still hunted them, and winter offered no mercy to men without shelter. Samuel hesitated, knowing that offering them his land would turn the town against him, that his neighbors would see his kindness as betrayal. But when he looked at the children curled beside his hearth, the choice felt less like treason and more like the only road a decent man could take. He led them beyond the ridge where the northern grove sheltered a clearing hidden from the main trails, its frozen stream and thicketed slopes offering a place to disappear until spring thawed the earth. There, they built crude shelters of branches and hides, Samuel working alongside them without fanfare, his axe swinging beside Taklisha's, as though they had known each other longer than a single desperate night. By sundown, the grove held the fragile bones of a camp, humble but alive, and for the first time since their paths crossed, laughter, small and hesitant, rose from the clearing as children tossed snow at one another beneath the bare cottonwoods. Samuel stood at the edge of the camp, the prairie wind cold against his face, and wondered how long peace could stretch before the world found it again, and tried to tear it down. It didn't take long for word to reach Dust Creek that Samuel Cross, the loner rancher no one much spoke to unless they needed a fence mended, was harboring Apaches in the northern grove, and when it did, the saloon filled with the sharp voices of men who spoke more with fear than facts. They gathered beneath the cracked rafters, arguing whether Samuel had lost his mind or betrayed his kind, and by sundown, a small group rode toward his cabin with rifles slung low and suspicion riding harder than their horses. Samuel heard them before he saw them, boots crunching frozen earth and spurs clinking in the dusk. He stepped from the porch, rifle resting easy but loaded, as 5 men reined their horses before his fence line. Their leader, A cattleman named Briggs, whose voice carried like a whip crack, wasted no words accusing Samuel of bringing trouble to their doorstep, claiming the army had barely cleared out the raiders, and here he was, inviting them back in. Samuel listened without blinking, his silence steady as stone, and when Briggs demanded he turn the Apaches over or be driven out himself, Samuel finally spoke, his voice quiet but sharp enough to cut through the noise. He told them the truth none of them wanted to hear, that these were not raiders, but families driven from their homes, freezing and starving in the hills because men like Briggs couldn't see the difference between a warrior and a child. The other riders shifted in their saddles, uneasy beneath the weight of his words, but pride kept their hands near their rifles. Samuel stood his ground, making no threats, only promises, that any man who crossed his fence with harm in his heart would find no mercy on this side of the ridge. Briggs spat into the snow, calling Samuel a fool, and turned his horse without firing a shot, his pride bruised but his courage untested. The others followed, casting backward glances not of hate, but of something closer to doubt. That night, Samuel returned to the grove, finding Taklisha tending to a broken trap, and the children huddled by the fire. He told them of the riders and the danger that might still come. And though Taklisha's face hardened, he only nodded, as if he'd lived too long to expect anything less. Beneath the cold stars, Samuel sat beside the fire, rifle across his knees, knowing the battle they fought was not of bullets but of hearts hardened by fear, and that war was the hardest to win. Snow fell steady and slow in the days that followed, covering the scars of the land in a quiet blanket that could not hide the tension lingering beneath. For though the riders from Dust Creek had turned back without a fight, their words still echoed through the town, like wolves circling unseen in the dark. Samuel Cross kept his watch each night, eyes scanning the ridge beyond his cabin, while the Apaches worked to strengthen their camp, building lean-tos against the wind and hunting cautiously in the lower valleys, where soldiers might not find them. Taklisha spoke little, but his actions showed trust Samuel had not expected, leaving his eldest son at the cabin each morning to learn from Samuel how to repair fences and tend to the cattle that winter could easily claim. The boy, called Nantan, worked in silence but with steady hands, and though their words were few, something like respect grew between them. But peace rarely settles for long in a land where fear writes its own laws, and one bitter night, the distant crack of a rifle shattered the stillness as a bullet tore through the barn's eaves, sending the cattle into a panic and splitting the cold air with sudden violence. Samuel grabbed his rifle and ran into the snow, his breath sharp in his throat as he scanned the tree line. But whoever fired the shot had already slipped into the darkness, leaving only a set of fading tracks and a message spoken in lead. The warning had been given. Next time they wouldn't miss. At the grove, Taklisha and his people heard the shot and gathered close, their eyes dark with the weight of a history that taught them not to trust second chances. Samuel told them to stay low for the night, that whoever was testing their resolve had not yet decided whether to strike or scare, but he knew in his bones that fear, once fed, grows hungrier than reason. As dawn broke cold and pale, Samuel rode into Dust Creek alone, walking into the saloon where silence fell like a dropped glass when he stepped through the door. He looked Briggs square in the eye and spoke quiet but clear, telling them that the next bullet fired would be answered, not with words, but with war, and if Dust Creek wanted peace, it would have to stop mistaking starving children for soldiers. Some lowered their eyes, ashamed, while others clenched their jaws, unwilling to yield. Samuel turned and left without waiting for an answer, knowing the next move belonged to a town still trapped between pride and conscience. The snow kept falling as the days stretched thin and brittle, blanketing the land in quiet that fooled no one. for beneath the white stillness, Dust Creek and the northern grove stood locked in a standoff neither side could afford to lose. Samuel Cross spent his mornings chopping wood and his nights walking the fence line, rifle in hand, the silence broken only by the distant howls of wolves and the soft voices of the Apache children who now played in the clearing, as if winter alone was their enemy. Taklisha worked beside him, repairing what little the land could still give them, but their conversations were few, each man carrying the weight of his people on shoulders long accustomed to standing alone. In town, Briggs gathered a small group of ranchers and merchants, men who feared not just the Apaches, but what it meant for a lone rancher to defy them and still hold his ground. They argued in whispers beneath the church steeple, weighing pride against practicality, some calling for a raid to drive the Apaches out before spring, others warning that the army would not look kindly on vigilante justice. Sheriff Dunn, a tired man caught between his badge and his neighbors, rode out alone one frost-bitten morning to see for himself what Samuel had built beyond the ridge. What he found was not a war camp, but a struggling group of families, children mending nets by the stream, and women tending to thin cook fires beneath pine shelters. He spoke to Taklisha and to Samuel, listening instead of accusing, and left the grove with more questions than answers, his duty now tangled in threads of mercy he could not ignore. That night, he stood before the council in Dust Creek and spoke plain. There was no war brewing in the north, only a handful of souls clinging to survival. And if the town struck first, they would be remembered not as protectors but as murderers. His words settled heavy across the room, silencing even Briggs for a moment. But fear is not easily quieted, and some hearts still burned for conflict. Back at the grove, Samuel and Taklisha shared a thin meal by the fire, the quiet between them filled with what neither dared say aloud. That peace may last another week, maybe two, but unless hearts changed, it would not last the winter. And beneath the frozen stars, as smoke rose thin into the endless dark, Samuel wondered if a man alone could hold the line between two worlds built on wounds too deep to heal. It was near the end of January when the standoff finally broke. Not with a bullet, but with a blizzard that swept across the plains like judgment itself, burying fences, freezing rivers, and silencing even the arguments of men too proud to listen to reason. Dust Creek found itself trapped beneath snowdrifts higher than wagon wheels, and for the first time in weeks, the townsfolk stopped speaking of the Apaches and started worrying about their own survival. Horses collapsed in their stalls, wells froze solid, and supplies thinned faster than tempers could be held. Samuel Cross, bundled against the cold, loaded his wagon with firewood, salted meat, and cornmeal, and rode straight into town without waiting for an invitation, his presence slicing through the quiet streets like a cold wind. At first, no one approached. Shame tangled in their throats as they watched the man they'd called a traitor, now offering the warmth they couldn't find on their own. But hunger makes stubborn men swallow pride, and one by one, they accepted his help. Briggs last of all, his hands rough as he took the sack of flour without meeting Samuel's steady gaze. Sheriff Dunn stood by, saying nothing, only tipping his hat with a small nod of respect that spoke louder than any sermon. Then, without waiting for thanks, Samuel turned his wagon north again, driving through the storm to the grove where the Apaches huddled beneath snow-choked trees. He shared what was left with Taklisha's people, dividing the meat and wood as evenly as the need allowed. And for the first time since the knocking on his door, Taklisha smiled, faint but true, a crack in the frozen distance between them. That night, as the storm howled across the prairie, Samuel sat by the fire with Nantan and the other children gathered close, telling them stories of his own boyhood beneath skies just as wide and cold, stories of hunting rabbits and breaking wild colts long before war carved the world in half. He spoke without bitterness, and they listened without fear, the simple kind of peace that needs no language to hold it together. In the morning, when the snow finally stopped, Dust Creek awoke to a world still divided by fences, but softened, if only slightly, by the shared struggle of survival. And in that brief quiet, where guns stayed silent and voices spoke low, Samuel dared to hope that sometimes storms break things down, so something better can be built from what's left standing. As the snow began to melt beneath the hesitant warmth of early spring, the lines between the northern grove and Dust Creek blurred in ways no man had planned, and what had started as survival became something harder to ignore. Taklisha's people ventured further from the grove, trading hand-carved tools and tanned hides with townsfolk who once would have shot them on sight, while Samuel Cross found himself riding the southern trails alongside Sheriff Dunn, mending fences and rounding up stray cattle that winter had scattered across the prairie. Briggs, prideful as ever, kept his distance, but even he could not deny that the land looked less like a battlefield and more like a field waiting to be planted. One afternoon, Samuel stood at the edge of the general store, watching as Ruth Halloway, the blacksmith's wife, traded flour for woven baskets Taklisha's daughters had made, their smiles cautious but real. No council vote had declared peace, no treaty had been signed beneath the church steeple, but here in the quiet exchanges of goods and glances, something like trust had taken root. Yet Samuel knew peace was a fragile thing on land, where scars ran deep, and the army's patrols still rode these hills, hungry for conflict where none was needed. He spoke with Taklisha by the creek, warning him that soldiers would soon return to clear the territory for settlers, and though they might spare the town, they would not spare those without deeds or titles to their names. Taklisha listened, his face lined with the burden of too many winters, and spoke simply of moving further west when the ground thawed, where rivers still ran wild and no fences claimed the earth. Samuel felt the weight of that goodbye long before it came, knowing that some distances are drawn not by choice, but by the world's refusal to let different people call the same place home. When the day came, it was without ceremony. The Apaches packed their camp in silence, leaving behind only the faint outlines of shelters and the lingering scent of smoke in the trees. Samuel stood alone by the trail as Taklisha and his people slipped into the dawn, a quiet farewell passing between them without words. Back in Dust Creek, life resumed its old rhythms, but something had shifted beneath the surface. Fewer glances carried fear, more carried thought. Samuel returned to his cabin, once again alone, but this time the silence felt less like a cage and more like a choice. And beneath the wide, endless sky, where storms once gathered and threats once knocked at midnight, he found a peace built not from winning a war, but from refusing to start one. Weeks passed beneath the slow stretch of spring, and Dust Creek eased back into its routines, though a quiet change lingered in the corners of every room where men once spoke of enemies and now spoke only of fences and cattle drives. Samuel Cross, once the loner whose only company was the prairie wind, now found himself greeted with nods in the general store and quiet handshakes outside the church, though few spoke of what happened during the long winter when the town's survival had rested on the shoulders of a man who opened his door to strangers. Sheriff Dunn visited Samuel's cabin one mild afternoon, riding slow beneath skies soft with morning haze, and they shared a cup of coffee on the porch without mention of titles or sides, only two men who had seen enough of conflict to know that some wars weren't fought with rifles, but with the stubborn refusal to hate. Together they watched the hills where Taklisha and his people had vanished weeks before. And though the land looked empty, Samuel felt their presence in every breeze that rustled the cottonwoods, a quiet reminder that kindness sometimes leaves without staying, but never leaves without changing what it touched. Briggs remained the last holdout of the old ways, his bitterness quiet but not forgotten. And though he spoke no more of raising a posse, his pride still rode beside him on every trip to town. But even he could not deny that the fences stood taller now, the cattle healthier, and the streets less sharp with suspicion. When the Army patrol finally rode through, stiff-backed and sharp-eyed, they found a town at peace, and no trace of the Apache camp they had hunted. Sheriff Dunn met them with calm answers, and no reason to stay, sending them south where rumors still whispered of unrest. And so the soldiers passed on, leaving Dust Creek untouched, and Samuel's cabin remained just a cabin, not a battleground. In the evenings, Samuel sat alone by his fire, no longer waiting for a knock at the door, but still listening for the wind that carried the voices of those who had knocked once and changed everything. He tended his cattle, repaired his fences, and planted a small patch of wildflowers beneath the oak where the children once played, a quiet memorial no stone would ever mark. And beneath the pale sweep of stars, he let the peace settle deep in his bones, knowing that though history would forget his name, the land would remember the winter when a quiet man said yes to mercy and no to fear. Spring gave way to summer, and the land around Samuel Cross's cabin breathed easier beneath golden skies and warm winds that softened the scars winter had left behind. The cattle roamed freely again across open pastures, their shadows stretching long in the afternoon light, while Samuel repaired his fences with the quiet steadiness of a man who expected no thanks and sought no reward. Dust Creek settled into a peace it barely understood, its people speaking less of enemies and more of harvests, weather, and trade. They no longer crossed the street when Samuel passed, but offered simple nods and quiet acknowledgments, the kind given to men who had proved something no argument could undo. Taklisha and his people remained only in memory, their footprints faded from the northern grove, but Samuel saw their presence in the wildflowers blooming along the ridge, in the repaired traps beside the stream, and in the lingering stillness that filled the spaces where fear once shouted loudest. He did not know if they had found a better place beyond the western hills, or if they still walked roads heavy with hardship, but he carried their story with him in every swing of his axe and every mile his boots traced. Across the land, Sheriff Dunn visited less often, though when he did, they spoke of practical things: cattle drives, broken fences, the price of flour, never needing to name the winter that had bound their fates together in uneasy friendship. Briggs remained a man unchanged in pride, but softened in action, his protests quieter now, his anger dulled by the months of peace he could no longer deny. As summer deepened, Samuel found himself alone once more, but this time the solitude felt earned, not imposed, and his home no longer a fortress but a shelter for those memories he refused to forget. One night, beneath a sky stretched wide and full of stars, he sat by his fire and listened to the prairie wind whisper through the cottonwoods, and in that quiet, he heard not the ghosts of war, but the voices of survival, of mercy, and of the fragile, fleeting peace they had fought to protect. He smiled, faint but real, and tipped his hat toward the horizon where the land met the sky, knowing some stories never reach the history books, but the earth keeps them anyway, buried in its roots and carried by its winds. And so he stayed, a quiet rancher on a lonely hill, tending his cattle and guarding a peace built not from victory, but from the simple, stubborn choice to let strangers through the door on a night when the world expected a gun.